The British Empire, once the largest empire in history, spanned over 5 continents, leaving a profound and often controversial legacy that continues to shape the modern world. Its story is one of exploration, conquest, trade, innovation, and eventual decline, marked by both achievements and dark chapters of exploitation and resistance. The seeds of the British Empire were sown during the age of exploration in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, when England began seeking its place in the world. While Spain and Portugal led the way in maritime exploration, England's first ventures into the Americas came through figures like John Cabot, whose 1497 journey to North America laid the foundation for British claims in the New World. However, it was in the 17th century that England's imperial ambitions began to take a more formal shape, especially with the establishment of the East India Company in 1600. This company, initially created to control trade in Asia, would later evolve into a vast colonial enterprise that brought vast wealth to Britain and deepened its influence over India and much of the Far East. As England's naval power grew, so did its colonial reach. The 17th and 18th centuries saw Britain establishing colonies in the Americas, including those in the Caribbean, where sugar and tobacco were cultivated by enslaved Africans, and the 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America. These colonies contributed to Britain's growing wealth, but they were also sites of conflict. The tension between Britain and its American colonies culminated in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. Leading to the loss of its most prosperous colony. Yet, while Britain lost its foothold in North America, its global influence continued to expand. The British Navy played an indispensable role in the empire's growth, enabling Britain to protect and expand its trade routes. The victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 during the Napoleonic Wars solidified British dominance over the seas, and by the early 19th century, Britain's global influence was undeniable. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century, provided the technological and economic foundation for further imperial expansion. Steamships, railways, and new agricultural methods facilitated the movement of goods and people, and the global exchange of resources helped fuel Britain's industrialization. At the height of its power in the 19th century, the British Empire was often described as the empire on which the sun never sets. Such was its vastness. Britain controlled much of India, a vital source of raw materials and wealth, and parts of Africa, including Egypt, South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. British territories were spread across the globe, from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The British were not just conquerors, they were also architects of a global trading system, spreading British culture, language, and institutions far and wide. In many ways, the British Empire was the engine of the global economy, with its colonies producing vast amounts of raw materials that fed Britain's industrial machines and markets. However, this period of imperial glory was also marked by exploitation and resistance. The British Empire thrived on the labor of enslaved Africans, especially in the Caribbean and parts of the American South. The slave trade, which Britain played a central role in, became one of the most profitable industries in the empire. Moreover, British control of India led to devastating famines and policies enforced by the East India Company, and later the British Raj, often drained India's resources while its people suffered. The British Empire's grip on its colonies was often maintained through violence, oppression, and systematic exploitation. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, however, cracks began to appear in the empire's facade. World War I, 1914 to 1918, severely drained Britain's resources and weakened its ability to control its far-flung colonies. Despite its victory in the war, Britain's global influence waned. Nationalist movements began to rise in many of its colonies, especially in India, where leaders like Mahatma Gandhi led nonviolent protests against British rule. The interwar period saw growing discontent in the colonies, and the economic hardships of the Great Depression further strained Britain's finances. World War II, 1939 to 1945, was the final blow to Britain's imperial ambitions. The war exhausted Britain both economically and militarily. The war also marked a shift in global power dynamics. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, while Britain found itself less able to maintain its imperial holdings. The weakening of British power was compounded by rising independence movements across the colonies. After the war, Britain began the process of decolonization. India, the jewel of the British Empire, gained independence in 1947, followed by many African and Caribbean nations in the 1950s and 1960s. The Suez Crisis of 1956, in which Britain attempted to take military action against Egypt over the nationalization of the Suez Canal, further exposed Britain's diminished global standing, particularly as it was pressured by the United States to back down. The 1960s and 1970s saw the end of British control over much of Africa and the Caribbean. The final symbolic end of the British Empire came in 1997, when Hong Kong was handed back to China, marking the end of British imperial rule in Asia. Though the British Empire had officially dissolved, its legacy remained, particularly through the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies, many of which retained ties to Britain through trade, politics, and culture. The legacy of the British Empire is complex and deeply intertwined with both positive and negative outcomes. On one hand, the empire helped spread English as a global language, promoted certain legal and political structures, and contributed to global trade. On the other hand, it was built on the exploitation of indigenous peoples, the destruction of cultures, and the economic oppression of vast swaths of the global population. The history of the British Empire is one of ambition and achievement, but also one of cruelty and inequality, a legacy that continues to shape the politics, culture, and economy of former colonies and the world at large. The story of the British Empire is not just one of territorial conquest, but also of profound global change, for better or worse. It is a story of the complexities of power, the contradictions of colonialism, and the indelible marks it left on history, society, and identity across the globe.